Well, good afternoon to all those in the audience and those joining us online. I'm Rob Litvak, Senior Vice President and Director of International Security Studies at the Wilson Center. I'd like to welcome you all to this important discussion about the evolving global trade architecture and its implications for Africa, hosted under the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum. We're joined today by distinguished members of the African and International Diplomatic Corps, policymakers and representatives from the private, NGO, and academic sectors, and members of the Africa Program Advisory Council. We're thankful to all of you for your support of the Wilson Center and the Africa Program, a wonderful, one of the crown jewels of the Wilson Center, led by the extraordinary Monde Mwangwa and her exemplary team that put today's event together. In the past 3 years since it was launched, the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum has provided a place for leaders and practitioners to discuss the most pressing trade and development issues that affect Africa and U.S.-Africa relations. It has brought the Wilson Center's Africa program to the forefront of discussions on U.S.-Africa economic relations, and none of this would be possible without the extraordinary generosity of Mr. Eddie and Mrs. Sylvia Brown. We are lucky to have Mr. Eddie Brown joining us a bit later for this discussion. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank him and his wife for their extraordinary support of the Africa Program and the Wilson Center in general over recent years, and thank the entire team at Brown Capital for their support on these great events. I would also like to extend a special welcome to Mr. Keith Lee, the President and Chief Operating Officer of Brown Capital Management, who's kindly offered to help us open the discussion. Today we are continuing in the Brown Capital tradition with a forward-leaning discussion on how political developments in the United States and United Kingdom, driven by forces of nationalism, are affecting wider global trade dynamics and architectures, and how this affects Africa. With some countries tightening their borders and enacting restrictions on free trade, it leaves many stakeholders wondering about the future of global trade and whether America First and Brexit are outliers or part of a wider trend toward protectionism. While the world is navigating these trends, Africa has been moving forward toward facilitating trade between countries. The African Continental Free Trade Area, signed this past March by 44 African countries, seeks to lower tariffs and other barriers between its signatories, with the goal of increasing intra-Africa trade as well as Africa's share of global trade. The expert panel we have convened today, representing the academic, government, and private sectors, will discuss all of these important trends and help us figure out ways forward for understanding and navigating new global trade dynamics. I would now like to introduce, even as we welcome Mrs. Brown I'm seeing in the back. Did you join us? Yes. Good afternoon. Welcome to this event, and thank you again for your extraordinary generosity in supporting it. But I'd like to now introduce Mr. Keith Lee, who is a great friend of the Wilson Center, to offer a few words to open today's event. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Litvak, Monde, our distinguished speakers and guests, and all of you in the audience for being here today. I am Keith Lee, President and Chief Operating Officer of Brown Capital Management. And I'm just looking. Rob thanked Sylvia for coming and indicated that Eddie would be coming a little later. If he had been 2 minutes earlier, he's just walking in, then I wouldn't have to be up here now. So thank you for your timing, Eddie. We at Brown Capital greatly appreciate your presence here today and your continued support and interest in the Africa Forum events hosted by our partners, the Wilson Center Africa Program. The Brown Capital Management Africa Forum events are opportunities to expand the discussion of critical economic and development issues in Africa and bring both challenges and opportunities to the forefront of policy conversations. Today, we will focus on a complex topic that requires attention, even as it continues to evolve. Over the last 2 years, we have seen political developments in Europe and the United States that suggest an inward-looking and insular approach to the conduct of international relations, including in the political and economic spheres. These developments have implications for current global trade architectures and for Africa. The Brown Capital Management Africa Forum is pleased to be able to support this important dialogue to help us understand the change, uncertainty, and challenges while not losing sight of the potential opportunities. With that, I would like to join Dr. Litvak in welcoming our excellent panel of speakers. And I know it's going to be a great discussion. We got started a little bit backstage before coming out. And to thank all of you to this discussion about Africa First, Brexit, and their implication for global trade dynamics and for Africa. Again, thank you to the Africa Program, the Wilson Center, and to our distinguished speakers and you, the audience, for all of your support of the Brown Capital Management Africa Forum and events, and for you being here today. I would now turn it over to Dr. Manyangwa. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lee, and good afternoon, everyone. Mr. and Mrs. Brown, Wilson Center Board members, members of the African Diplomatic Corps, and members of the Africa Program Advisory Council, and all of you, the participants who've taken time out of your busy schedules to be here today. My name is Monday Muyangwa, and I'm the director of the Wilson Center's Africa Program, and I'll be your moderator for this event. To those of you following us on webcast and on Twitter, we welcome all of you as well. To those of you on Twitter, you can follow the live tweets of today's event by following the Africa Program's Twitter account @AfricaUpClose, and you can contribute to the discussion using the hashtag #AmericaFirst and Africa, all one word. As has been mentioned, for many, America First in the US and Brexit in the UK appear to be based on economic nationalism and protectionism. The role and place of these two countries within the larger global community means that their actions and policies could have a significant impact on global trade architectures and dynamics. For example, it is not clear how Brexit will impact the European Union's economic partnership agreements with Africa or the G20 Compact on Africa in terms of trade and economic engagement between the United Kingdom and Africa, as well as the European Union and Africa in both the short and the long term. Meanwhile, under America First, the United States has taken some critical decisions relating to trade, including withdrawing from the TPP and also the more recent talk about tariffs. However, so far, there has not been a clear official articulation of what America First means in terms of US economic engagement with Africa, including in the trade space, but also about the potential impact that it will have on altering the global trade architectures and what this will mean for Africa. As was mentioned earlier, Africa seems to be moving in the opposite direction as it seeks more economic integration, international trade facilitation, and more recently, as we saw with the signing of the Continental Free Trade Agreement by 44 African countries in March of 2018. So our discussion here today will look at the impact of these two developments on the larger global trade architecture, assess the evolution of Africa's own trade architectures, and how it engages with the rest of the world. We will also ask our speakers to evaluate the challenges and opportunities for navigating America First and Brexit, and more importantly, to offer recommendations about how we can enhance intra-African trade, South-South trade, increase Africa's overall share of the global trade within this rapidly evolving environment. And we have an outstanding panel to talk to us about these issues. I will now introduce them, and I'll do so in the order in which they will speak. You have their full bios in the materials that we handed out, so I'll just give brief bios. Dr. Kristen Hopewell will kick things off for us. She is a senior lecturer in international political economy and she's joining us from the University of Edinburgh in the UK. She has written and researched extensively on international trade, global governance, industrial policy, and development, with a focus on emerging powers. And in 2016, she wrote the award-winning book, Breaking the WTO, How Emerging Powers Disrupted the Neoliberal Project. Given her background on this world trade issues and architectures, we've asked her to speak to us about what America First and Brexit mean, their primary components, their implications for global trade architecture. We've also asked her to highlight the key challenges, opportunities, and long-term implications of America First and Brexit, and to offer 3 recommendations for Africa and its international partners on the way forward. She will be followed by Mr. Joel Wygant, who is the Principal Director for Government Services at Nextant. Prior to his current position, he spent over 10 years as a Foreign Service Officer with the U.S. Department of State, where he worked on AGOA, the Millennium Challenger Corporation, as well as other development-related issues in countries such as South Africa, Ghana, Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Angola. We have asked him to explore with us what America First means and its implications for U.S. trade policy in general and for trade with Africa in particular. How has America First been translated into policy and programs thus far? And what does he anticipate will be the next steps? We've also asked him to offer a key assessment on other areas of U.S.-Africa trade engagement, including AGOA, and how African countries and the United States can best leverage AGOA and move forward to the next level. Likewise, he too has been asked to give us some concrete recommendations for the way forward. Our third and final speaker, but certainly not the least for today, will be Dr. Raymond Gilpin, who's the Academic Dean at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies at the National Defense University. He has a long background in international economics and finance, including service as a senior economist at the African Development Bank Group, the research director at the Central Bank of Sierra Leone, and an economist at the World Bank. We have asked him to speak to America First and Brexit, focusing specifically on his view of how Africans are interpreting them, how Africa's major international trading partners view Brexit and America First as they relate to their own engagement in Africa, and to address the major developments in Africa's continental free trade area in the context of these larger global developments. And he too has been asked to offer 3 concrete and actionable recommendations for African governments to more effectively engage within this larger global architecture. So each of our speakers has been asked to speak to us for no more than 10 minutes, after which we'll open the floor up to audience Q&A and engagement. And with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Hopewell to kick things off. Dr. Hopewell.
Great. Thank you, and thank you very much to our organizers today for putting on such an interesting event and inviting me to be here and participate. Now, with Trump's America First trade policies and Brexit, we're seeing twin looming threats of growing disorder and disintegration in the global trading system. Looking first at the impact of Trump and his policies. Under Trump, we see the U.S. abandoning the rules-based multilateral trading system and instead turning to aggressive unilateralism, with the U.S. threatening to impose tariffs on imports from China, imposing tariffs on steel and aluminum, and now potentially escalating that to also include autos and parts under very dubious national security grounds against a whole range of American trading partners. We also see the U.S. using the threat of withdrawing from free trade agreements such as NAFTA in an effort to try to strong-arm countries into renegotiating those agreements and making concessions. So these acts have been seen around the world as blatant protectionism and a flagrant violation of WTO rules. Many countries, including China, the EU, and Japan, have all indicated their intention to retaliate by imposing their own tariffs, meaning that we could be on the brink of a global trade war that could rapidly spiral out of control and profoundly affect many other countries. In addition, the U.S. is also blocking appointments to the WTO's appellate body, which means that the WTO's dispute settlement mechanism is in danger of effectively shutting down. So there's no question that Trump's policies pose a major threat to the multilateral trading system. Under Trump, we see the U.S. wielding its market power in a highly arbitrary and capricious way, refusing to be bound by the rule of law and instead resorting to the raw use of power to try to get its way. So other countries are faced with a strategic question of how to respond. One option is to give in and make concessions to try to appease Trump, to try to minimize the immediate commercial pain for their exporters. But the danger is that in giving in to U.S. demands, that will simply embolden Trump, legitimate his strategy, show that U.S. bullying can in fact get its way, and encourage him to continue and go even further. Many countries have initiated or are planning to challenge Trump's policies at the WTO, but there's also a fear that if the WTO were to rule against the U.S., which indeed it likely would, Trump would simply abandon the institution altogether. So looking at the implications for Africa, given his erratic behavior, it remains extremely difficult to try to predict how Trump's trade agenda will play out. If there is a full-blown trade war between the U.S. and China, for instance, or the U.S. and the EU, its effects will trickle through global supply chains and be felt around the world. Most importantly for Africa, a U.S.-China trade war that substantially disrupts China's exports or economy would lower demand for and the price of Africa's chief exports, commodities. In addition, we also see now that Trump is pushing China to increase its purchase of U.S. agriculture and energy exports. If he succeeds, this would displace exports from other countries. And depending on the products involved, this could potentially affect African countries. Now, there may be a small opportunity for African countries to benefit in a very limited sense from a potential U.S.-China trade war. If the U.S. imposes tariffs on imports from China, that could accelerate the movement of Chinese manufacturing to other low-cost producers, including in Africa. So if we look at the Japanese precedent, back in the 80s with the Plaza Accords, the U.S. forced a revaluation of the Japanese currency upward in an effort to try to address the U.S. trade deficit. That led to a movement of manufacturing from Japan to elsewhere in Asia. So it's possible that we could see something similar today, where Chinese companies move production abroad in order to provide a platform for exporting to the U.S. at lower tariff rates. African countries could potentially capture some of that displaced manufacturing activity. But for most African countries, these effects are likely to be small and vastly outweighed by the much larger negative effects of a global trade war. A significant disruption of trade would lead to lower global economic growth and lower global incomes to the detriment of everyone. So ultimately, it will depend on how far things go. The big fear, of course, is that we will see a return to the 1930s, the last major global trade war, where with the outbreak of the Depression, countries responded by putting up massive tariff walls to block imports, and the result was a collapse in international trade. That severely exacerbated the Great Depression and many believe contributed to the outbreak of World War II. So a global trade war today would not only lead to significant economic damage, but also increased political tensions. Turning then to Brexit and its impact. The referendum, with a very narrow margin voting in favor of leaving the EU, provided a mandate for negotiating Britain's exit, but with no plan or indication of what Brexit would actually look like. Now, 2 years after the referendum, there remains tremendous uncertainty about what form Brexit will take. Ultimately, the implications of Brexit will depend on the final outcome that's arrived at. Essentially, the further away from the current situation of membership in the EU customs union and the single market, the more negative the effects will be on the British economy. So from an economic perspective, essentially all of the options on the table right now are bad. All will leave the UK worse off than it is today. The only question is really how bad it'll be. Increasingly, it looks like the prospect of an agreement between the UK and the EU is extremely dim. UK Brexiteers, to be frank, seem to be operating in something of a fantasy land, thinking that they can have their cake and eat it too. They want essentially to try to maintain their current access to the EU market and the frictionless trade that they have now, but without the EU's requirement for labor mobility, being subject to EU law or the European Court of Justice. The EU has made it clear that it will never agree to this. So as the March 2019 deadline for leaving the EU looms ever closer, it looks increasingly like we may be headed for a cliff edge, hard Brexit in which the UK crashes out of the EU. This would cause chaos and intense economic disruption in both the UK and Europe. Now, invariably, it's the British economy that would be hit the hardest. And looking at the broader implications of this, a severe economic contraction in the UK caused by Brexit could have ripple effects for Africa through a number of channels. The first is through a reduction in demand for Africa's exports. But we may also see reduced aid funding, as well as a fall in foreign direct investment coming from Britain. Another issue is that upon leaving the EU, the UK will need to renegotiate all of its existing trade agreements that it's currently party to as a member of the EU. That's over 100 trade agreements, including the terms of its WTO membership, as well as a range of bilateral and regional FTAs, including the EPAs, the Economic Partnership Agreements, that involve many African countries. So it's highly unlikely that the UK, as a smaller individual economy, will be able to simply replicate the same trade deals that it had as part of the EU. This could provide an opportunity for African countries. Certainly, they'll be in a better bargaining position against an isolated UK, as well as against an EU minus the UK. So African countries may be able to push for additional concessions and better deals with both the UK and the EU. But this process of renegotiation will take time, and that period of uncertainty could be damaging to African trade with Britain. So finally, to conclude with some policy recommendations for Africa and other developing countries. First, I think recent developments underscore the importance of efforts to diversify export markets, to try to reduce dependence on any one market, whether that be the US, the EU, or China. Second, uncertainty and instability in the world's major markets increases the incentive for African countries to focus on regional economic integration and strengthening the regional market. And this provides increased impetus for the African Continental Free Trade Area, the CFTA. The challenge over the long term will be to make sure that each country benefits. The benefits don't just flow to the most advanced countries in the region. And another issue is that simply tearing down internal barriers to trade alone is not sufficient. There's also a need for a constructive industrial policy at the regional level to help foster infant industries. Third, we're seeing efforts by other states to try to preserve the WTO and maintain the functioning of the multilateral trading system in the face of the existential threat posed by Trump's policies. So it's important that African states play an active role to make sure they have a seat at the table and a voice in those discussions to ensure that their interests are represented. Fourth and lastly, in focusing on the trade policy changes in the US and Europe, it's important that we not lose sight of what's going on with China. Amid growing frustration with the US and UK, we could imagine many developing countries being tempted to turn instead towards China. We know China is trying to take advantage of the vacuum in US leadership in the trading system and present itself as a champion of free trade, as well as a leader of the developing world. While I think Trump's claims about China's unfair trade practices are highly problematic from a development perspective, that doesn't mean that African countries shouldn't have their own concerns about China's trade policies. There have recently been important changes in China's trade policies that have significant implications for developing countries, particularly a dramatic increase in subsidies for China's agriculture and fisheries sectors. So if we take cotton, for example, one commodity that's crucial to many African countries, China is now the world's largest cotton subsidizer, providing 5 times more cotton subsidies than the US. Its policies have huge implications for the C4 West African cotton producers, as well as for other developing country cotton producers in Africa. Chinese subsidies for agriculture and fisheries have been largely overlooked in current debates about China's trade policies, but they have significant implications for developing countries, both in Africa and around the world. So it's important not to let Trump and his agenda hijack all contemporary discussions and debates on trade. So I'll wrap up there and I'll look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Joel, you have the tough task of America First. Let's go.
Well, thank you very much for having me and for this easy assignment that you passed my way. I will say this is not the first time that I've had this discussion. The morning after the presidential elections, I was working at the American Embassy in South Africa, and I had offered to some colleagues at one of the large American financial institutions that I'd come and brief their clients on what the outcome of the election meant for South Africa and for Africa and for broader both economic and political issues. And we're quite excited. We prepared our stuff and we watched the election results came in, and then we ran back to the embassy and re-prepared our stuff and turned things around. And my, you didn't hear that from me. I've left the government now, so I'm a bit more free. And my boss said, "Are you sure you want to go do this?" And I said, I can't back out now. And what was 40 people turned into 75 people. And I explained a number of things that I thought then President-elect Trump might do. I got a number of them wrong. I won't give you a percentage. And I probably will get a number of them wrong again today, but I'm going to give it a shot. So bear with me. I think talking about America First is simple in theory, right? It's a pretty good tagline, America First. It's quite clear where we're going, what we're heading for. And I think the idea that domestic economic goals trump all, pun intended, is a pretty clear way to define America first. And within a foreign policy context, and I've had a number of arguments about this, it's really a version of realpolitik focused around a narrower set of interests than you would talk about in your kind of Intro to Relations 101 course. And so you're looking at a realpolitik with a heavy, winner-take-all kind of economic attitude. So you've got the groundwork, you've got a theory of change that America first, this will be our policy, and we're going to put our domestic policy up front of our our foreign policy, and we're going to run with that. Now, running with that is the hard part, and I think we've seen how complicated it is to enact America first, especially when you don't have an agreement inside the executive branch on what that means. And so we've watched this play out in the newspapers, not related to Africa, fortunately for the Africans, but related to China. And we've seen and watched the Chinese probably take advantage of the United States and the fact that they can see those fracturing positions occurring literally in front of them and to take advantage of them as they work through things. So getting America first right requires a kind of cohesive theory and narrative that I don't fully see yet. So it makes it more difficult in a context like this to kind of project forward as to where we see that going and where I see kind of changes, especially in trade policy. On Africa, it gets even a bit more difficult because you have a lack of attention to African issues writ large. You've got some unfortunate comments that may or may not have been made by President Trump. And you've got a lack of leadership in the kind of Africa space at the senior levels that don't give a lot of clarity on where things are headed. So as a former American government official, I can tell you where I'd like it to go. I can tell you what I would suggest to the next assistant secretary or to different people at the White House. But I can't suggest where it's going to go because I don't have a clear look on what those people are thinking. I haven't heard them give speeches. There haven't been a lot of African foreign policy speeches given by this administration yet that serve as those guideposts that help me to articulate this for an audience like you. So, that's my best shot at kind of defining it, and it's a bit of a slippery thing to define. I can tell you in terms of how I think it's translated into African trade policy, and I think there's two things that I want to bring up. So, one, and it was touched on already, you've got a shift from a multilateral trade framework to a bilateral trade framework. So the conversation, and Secretary Ross made this very clear at an event that I was at, where he said, AGOA will stay, AGOA being I'll define this later, kind of a multilateral institution, at least in Secretary Ross's mind. But what I really want is bilateral trade agreements with African countries. That's what we're going to be focusing on, is finding countries to negotiate bilateral trade agreements. And that's the future of trade policy for the African continent, at least with the United States. The other thing that he alluded to, and this was done very carefully, and some of my colleagues disagree with my interpretation of this, but in the latest renewal of AGOA, they hid in there a provision that allows for out-of-cycle review. So normally AGOA is reviewed every year, and it's weighed on the idea that are you a kind of a democratic country that's moving in the right direction, or are you not? And if you are, you're in AGOA, and if you're not, then you're out for a while and you're in the parking lot. Now there's an opportunity to do more often these out-of-cycle reviews. And the first time that this or kind of traditional out-of-cycle review was used was actually under the Trump administration. It was in South Africa, and it was one of the issues that I worked on extensively when I was there. So it's possible now for the Trump administration to turn AGOA, which I think is a fabulous carrot, into a stick, and to start using it to put more pressure on African countries to look out for America first rather than to look out for the development of those countries, which I think was the kind of premise of AGOA to begin with. And I think this is kind of playing itself out to a certain degree in the second-hand clothes discussion that's going on right now, where there were 4 countries who took a stand on the U.S. regarding the export of U.S. American second-hand clothes into Africa. And for those of you who haven't had the chance to visit many countries in Africa, you often see like a Green Bay Packers t-shirt walking by you when you're in the car. This clothing is, I think there's one market in Ghana, I believe, it's called the dead white man's market, because they can't believe that people would give this clothes away. So it's very predominant in these countries. And so these 4 countries decided to take a poke at the U.S. and say, we want this to stop because we'd like to create our own market. The U.S. has pushed back very aggressively. 3 of the 4 countries have backed down because they didn't want to lose their benefits under AGOA. Rwanda and President Kagame is holding out. I think he's holding out for broader geopolitical reasons. But it can hurt. And I think that the idea behind AGOA wasn't to punish countries like Rwanda. Now, maybe the poultry discussion in South Africa might actually be a use for this out-of-cycle review. I'm not sure that the Rwanda is the right way to do it. So let's get in and have a conversation under AGOA under Trump. And I think one of the things that it's very careful that when I talk about AGOA is not, everybody's like, oh, it's a great trade agreement. It's not an agreement. It's an act. It's a, there's no two-sidedness to this. We are granting duty-free provisions to African countries because that's what we as a country have decided to do. So I think to some degree as a foundation of our economic engagement with Africa, it's almost generous to a fault. And I say that in the fact that when you have countries like South Africa a part of AGOA, then you start to have a little bit of trouble. So I often say that, it's kind of like letting the rich kid at school get free lunch. It doesn't necessarily make sense to have this degree of countries being part of a generous trade agreement like this. So some of the America First kind of commercial focus there, could be helpful in terms of transforming AGOA into a trade arrangement that's good for Africa and good for the U.S. I think there is something to be said there. But I don't think the way that it's been used thus far is getting that balance and that nuance correct at all. For the African countries, holding on to AGOA and pushing for AGOA, and I think for those of us in this room, continuing to talk about the benefits for AGOA is incredibly important. And I think while I talk about kind of this balance, nuance there in terms of using AGOA both for our interests and for African interests, it's really important for a lot of these countries. And as an open window into the largest market on the planet, I think it's something that's very valuable. And if I were South Africa, I wouldn't want to give up on that valuable opportunity also. Let me get into 3 concrete recommendations. It's a little tricky to come up with concrete recommendations, but I have 3. I think African countries right now, and I say this, as a former diplomat, I can be a little bit more forward-leaning. I think they need to keep their heads down a little bit right now in regards to the United States. If I were advising them, I'd say be polite, continue these conversations, but be wary of what you're getting into, because I'm not sure it's clearly defined kind of who you're negotiating with, and I think that makes it trickier to have those sorts of conversations. So I've heard that Kenya is on the target list for a free trade agreement with the United States. There's a lot of interest in Kenya. For the Kenyans, be careful about what you wish for and be wary of shiny objects that you can't kind of effectively deal with. I think for the U.S. executive branch, I think it's time that it really needs to up its game in regards to Africa. And this is a consistent theory. You hear this all the time. You hear folks talking about U.S. versus China or China versus the EU. I think Congress is doing the right things. I think there's some good stuff coming out. The BUILD Act, it's moving its way through. I heard it might pass before this summer, and that would basically create an OPIC on steroids to help push a lot of U.S. companies out and also to develop the private sector in these markets. The MCC and AGOA Modernization Act is a step in the right direction. I'm not seeing that same focus from the executive branch, and I think it's to the detriment of our companies. And I think the last one, and this is something I tell a lot of investors who are looking at Africa, and I think for anybody who's paying attention to the economic space, is just be patient and persistence. And I think these things will work themselves through. We were talking in the back room about import substitution and how it didn't work and how it could work again. These things come and go. These conversations, and head down this path for a while, and then they meander back this way, and then they come back this way again. I'm bullish on the African continent. I'm bullish on America's economic relationship with African countries. And I think things will kind of get back to a more kind of stable platform. But for right now, I think America First is a tricky space for the Africans to navigate effectively.
Okay. Thank you. Dr. Gilpin.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking the Wilson Center and Brown Capital for bringing us all together to discuss what I believe is a very important topic. Special shout out to those of you joining us via webcast. Thank you so much for joining us. I wanted to take a look at this conversation from the African perspective. Okay, what does this mean on the continent? And practically, how does this translate within the context of the new Continental Free Trade Agreement? Let me start by just providing a little bit of context. We have a lot of conversation about multilateralism versus bilateralism in trade. Let's be honest, the WTO has not worked well for Africa. Okay, it needs a lot of refinement to be effective. African countries themselves gravitate towards blocks. And so I think the issue of multilateralism lost might be a false starter. Secondly, what's going on elsewhere in the world, whether it's in Asia or Latin America or in the United States or the United Kingdom with Brexit, I think if we boil it down to its barest minimum, we're talking about two things: about significant players in the global economy putting national interests first, beyond, everything else, and secondly, a focus on transactional bilateral agreements rather than multilateral convenience with trade. That's what we're talking about. What does this mean for Africa within the context of this new free trade agreement? It is like happenstance that it's happened at this particular point in time. It wasn't planned in terms of timing. Conversations about this free trade agreement started in 2012. It took 8 rounds and 5 years to get here. And so the timing does not really have a lot to do with what's happening in the United Kingdom or in the United States. But the reality is that we're now seeing a good faith effort across the African continent of countries to come together and pursue shared trade goals. The Free Trade Agreement is step one of a 3-phased initiative that's geared towards improving productivity, enhancing welfare, and just improving the continent's standing in the global commons when it comes to trade and economic issues. And so context-wise, it's important. What's going on elsewhere is also important, but I think let's look at what's going on within the continent. Let me start. They always say the devil is in the details. I'm just going to throw out 3 numbers and talk around those 3 numbers to see what does this tell us about this trade, about the trade deal, and how does that influence the rest Africa's trade relations with the rest of the world. First number is 55. Those of you who read the African Union's communique on the Free Trade Agreement mentioned the 55 members. But we all know that there are 54 African states. Why 55? Because Western Sahara signed. This is this is like a leading indicator in terms of the political complexity of this particular arrangement. Morocco is not going to be happy. The Morocco-ECOWAS relationships are going to be even more fraught, etc., etc. So it's not a really nice, cozy deal of all of Africa. Even that number, 55, tells you that the political realities of economic integration are fraught with a number of challenges we're going to have to get over, with or without what's going on in the rest of the world. Second number is 16.1 billion. That's the estimated welfare benefits to the African continent from the free trade agreement. And if you read a number of the clippings, the African Union's own announcement talk about 16.1 billion. Where did they get that number from? A lot of modeling was done to kind of estimate what benefits would African countries get if we have all the supply chains in place, et cetera, we sign the right trade deals, and all of those issues. 16.1 billion assumes that all the signatory countries reduce all the tariffs they're supposed to reduce at the same time and completely for 90% of trade. That's not going to happen. You look at the alternate scenarios in the modeling, I think the best case scenario is 7.6 billion, less than half of the original. Why is that important? It's important because how countries liberalize trade matters. Is it going to be a linear liberalization? Are they going to do it in tranches over time? Is it going to be selective? Are some countries going to view certain trading goods or services as special or protected or national security in nature? All of that kind of would determine how much productivity gains we have, what the welfare benefits are going to be, how many jobs are created, and what the market size is going to look at the end. Another number is 2028. That's when, after the Free Trade Act of 2018, expecting the Common Market Act in 2023, and then Economic and Monetary Union in 2028. There's a lot of water that will flow under the bridge between now and then. The challenges internally are significant. So, regardless of what the trading ecosystem looks like outside Africa, there are significant challenges within the continent to make this worthwhile for investors and to make this of practical benefit to not just African countries, but every African citizen. So, what do I see? And we can talk about the pros and the cons and the numbers during the Q&A, but what would I recommend? I was asked to recommend 2 or 3, so I added 2 and 3 and got 5. But I'll go through them really quickly. The free trade agreement focuses on reducing by almost 90% tariff barriers to trade, making it easier for African countries to trade with each other and the rest of the world. Doesn't say a lot about non-tariff barriers. And there are 4 important ones I'd like to flag. The first is governance. The second is corruption. The third is connectivity, both virtual and physical. And the fourth is violent conflict. We find that, in the absence of significant improvements or significant movement as far as these non-tariff barriers are concerned, no matter how much you do in terms of the tariff barriers, you're still going to have significant problems. So you need to have concomitant approaches that would take both forward at the same time. Second recommendation, it is clear that there's going to be short-term pain. There are many reasons, but let me just explain one. One of the assumptions is reduce tariffs, countries, and let's assume we have an industrial policy, countries will start manufacturing and all will be well. But that assumes mobility in the labor market, which there is not. across the African continent. You need significant training and skills transfers, etc., to be able to have that kind of mobility. So that means in the short term, there are going to be unemployment costs. There are probably also going to be some welfare costs. Most of the benefits are medium and long term. So my second recommendation for African countries is concrete plans to mitigate short-term adjustment costs of this trade change. Third, I would say African countries have to figure out how to bargain collectively. We have a lot of, interesting conversations about this, but when it comes down to what are African countries bargaining over, and how do they negotiate in a way that reflects regional priorities, not just narrow national fixation? We are not good at it. Africa has not been good at it throughout the history of the WTO, and there's very little that's being done now to prepare them for what should be the bulwark of a free trade area, common market, i.e. the ability to negotiate collectively. We really have to do that. Fourth, I think they need to revisit the role of the regional economic communities, or the RECs. Currently, the Act recognizes the role of the regional economic communities, but kind of has the language suggests that what the free trade agreement prescribes overrides the RECs. With peace and security, with the RECs, the African Union, there's a concept called subsidiarity, where it is understood that there are certain things that the RECs could do well. Have them as the first responders. Having it the other way around with trade could be a little problematic, because at the moment, a lot of the trade drivers are sub-regional, not continental. And so we have to revisit the role of the RECs. And lastly, I think that coordination and enforcement mechanisms really have to be considered, because the expectation that somehow is going to happen in Addis, I think, is a little optimistic. We need to have coordination and enforcement mechanisms at national, sub-regional, and continent-wide levels. Then we could start seeing how Africa and African countries are better placed in the global commons. Because whether it is in the United States or in Europe or in Asia, the reality is that major trading entities are going to be increasingly focusing on their interests and are going to be less altruistic moving forward. I think Africa has to prepare and not assume that we could convince those entities to change course and direction, because it's not going to happen. Thank you very much.
All right, I couldn't have asked for a better start to the issues that we're here to address today. Three very good and different perspectives, but I think all of them going to the heart of the issues. This is one thing I love about being here, where you get these very different perspectives, where you can really get into the discussions. So let me now open it up to your questions to our speakers. And those of you who've been here understand and know the drill. So if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment, please raise your hand. We will, once I acknowledge you, you have a minute to make your comment. I'll ask your question, identify yourself, the name and the organization with which you're affiliated, and the speaker to whom you're addressing the question. We will take 3 questions at a time and allow our speakers an opportunity to respond, and then we'll go out for another round. All right, so the floor is open. And I see one hand right there that went up almost immediately, and my old colleague, Roger Mark. It's good to see you. So we'll start over there, we'll come over here, and then to the lady over here.
Good morning,
Sir.
and thank you for a terrific program. My name is Richard Newfarmer. I'm the country director for Rwanda and Uganda in the International Growth Center. This is a joint venture of the London School of Economics and Oxford University. This is a terrific panel. Just a couple of points. First of all, Christian, I would have thought that you would have focused a little bit on the possibilities of expanding EBA, the Everything But Arms program that the European Union adopted for Africa almost immediately as a consequence of Brexit. That is, advocating that the British government mimic this program and take it on rather quickly. This is a very important program, and it's sort of the AGOA counterpart. And there's no reason why the UK could not immediately just simply adopt that program. And it would be a very powerful signal to welcoming Africa into the post-Brexit world. The second point is I want to underscore and applaud the comment of Mr. Gilpin on the role of economic diplomacy and learning how to negotiate. I had the good fortune of working in Geneva for 5 years and with African ambassadors, and frequently, perhaps like in other areas, international trade policy and investment policy is conducted by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And the competence to do that kind of economic analysis that requires formulating a negotiating position and then carrying it out is often quite limited in ministries of foreign affairs. So thinking about ways of moving, improving economic diplomacy on the part of Africa is really very important. The final point I'd like to make is a question, if I could just ask one quick question.
You have exactly 20 seconds.
I can do that in 10. You mentioned, Kirsten, the constructive industrial policy. I wonder if you'd expand on that a little bit.
Okay. Roger Mark, there's a mic right behind you.
Thank you very much. Excellent panel. I'm Roger Mark. This is the president and CEO of Sister Cities International and a fellow here at the Wilson Center. And I wanted to allude to a point that Raymond raised. Raymond talked about the sub-regional importance of looking at these issues. I'd like to even take that down to the level of a subnational level. And to raise this point also about diplomacy, but citizen diplomacy. So at Sister Cities International, we have more than 125 relationships between U.S. cities and cities in Africa. And these are premised mostly on trade and investment. So the incoming chairman of our board is the mayor of San Antonio, and they're partnered with Namibia. And they're specifically looking at how we engage that. So you have mayors at a very local level who are interested in trade and investment above and beyond what's happening at a national or regional level. So what's the opportunity space for us here to engage at that level of locally elected officials? And then when you have a citizen diplomatic movement like Sister Cities International, what's the opportunity space there also? So I'll be interested in hearing your responses. Thank you.
Okay. The lady right next. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jan Smith on the Wilson Council, and my question goes to Kristen's remarks on subsidies. The Chinese subsidies 5 times higher for cotton than the U.S., and can you tell us what other products are subsidized at great imbalanced ratio from China, and what do we do about it?
All right. Lots of really good questions, and the status of the EPAs in Africa, capacity building on economic diplomacy, explain a little bit more what constructive industrial policy looks like, opportunities for local level participation and engagement on this issue, and then unpacking Chinese subsidies a little bit more so we understand exactly what the picture looks like in terms of what those subsidies are, what products and levels, I guess. I think a majority of them were to you, so I'll start right here.
Great.
Yeah.
So I'll start with the question about the EBA program. There are a couple issues. One, I think the Brexit process in the UK is right now in a state of sheer chaos. I mean, there's complete discord within the cabinet, within the Conservative Party, within Parliament. There's no clear picture of what Brexit will look like, even internally within the UK, in terms of coming up with their negotiating position, before you even get to the point of trying to then negotiate with the EU, where there's clearly going to be immense conflict. So I think realistically, the UK is going to be scrambling just to try to deal with these immense challenges and just to get its domestic house in order before it can start really looking at changes in its aid policies, including through allowing trade preferences for developing countries. This is something that's going to be preoccupying the UK for a long, long time. There's been a lot of talk about the UK being able to do innovative things with development aid, et cetera, but I think that that's not going to be high on the government's priority list for quite some time. The other thing in the UK is that one of the government's goals currently, the Conservative Party and especially the pro-Brexit camp, is for the UK to regain an independent trade policy so that it can negotiate its own trade agreements, put its own policies in place, and they're placing tremendous priority on this. So it's not looking to replicate the same deals necessarily that the EU had. It's looking to do its own thing in this area. On the question of industrial policy and what would a constructive industrial policy look like, I'm thinking here particularly with Trump's intense criticism of China and its trade policy, its industrial policy. There's been, a big part of Trump's rationale for launching this trade war, for imposing these Section 301 tariffs, slapping tariffs on Chinese imports, has been his opposition, his criticism of China's trade and industrial policy and saying this is unfair trade, the types of things China is doing in its Made in China 2025 program, for example, subsidies, restrictions on foreign investment, forced technology transfer. These are illegitimate policies. And I think there's a reason why developing countries in Africa and around the world should be concerned about that discourse, that narrative. These are the types of policies that countries in Africa and elsewhere should be wanting ultimately to put in place themselves if they're not already. So with the Continental Free Trade Area in Africa, it's not enough just to tear down the internal trade barriers. If you actually want to foster infant industries, you're ultimately going to want to use some of these very same policies. You're going to want to use subsidies. You're going to want to use external tariffs around the region to build up your industries, to move up the value chain. You're going to want to use restrictions on foreign investment. You're going to want to try to get foreign firms to transfer technology to domestic players. So the types of policies that Trump is criticizing China for using are exactly the types of policies that other developing countries have historically used to develop, and they're the types of policies that African countries should be looking to use as well, and likely will be in future. And in terms of China's subsidies for agriculture, in addition to cotton, most of China's other subsidies are focused on staple food commodities. There are a variety of reasons for that. Partly they're driven by domestic policy concerns about the massive rural-urban income disparity in China, trying to foster rural development. But a second concern for China is security-related. There is a concern in the event of a conflict with the U.S. that China could lose its access to global food markets. And with a country that's highly dependent on imports, they're now using subsidies to try to boost domestic food production, as well as cotton production and a couple of other commodities. The problem is that this has, externalities. This has massive implications for cotton producers, food producers, agricultural exporters around the world, including many African countries. It also has implications for the U.S. as well. So this is an area where African countries and the U.S., in theory, would share an interest in trying to get China to reduce its subsidies. There have been negotiations ongoing on agriculture subsidies since the collapse of the Doha round. This is post-Doha. There's been standalone negotiations on agriculture subsidies trying to reach some kind of agreement to lower subsidies, and that would be particularly the U.S. and China together agreeing to lower their subsidies. But those negotiations are now at an impasse. So this is an area where, the WTO could potentially play a significant role in advancing the interests of Africa, of other exporters, but because of the bloc negotiations, that's not working out.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Dr. Gilpin, I'll come to you, and then I'll have Joel weigh in on this set of questions. I think you had one directed your way, perhaps two.
Okay, no, thank you. I'd just like to echo a lot that has already been said. A point on Roger Mark's issue about subnational trade. We're finding that, yes, we're looking at a continent-wide trade agreement, but the actual drivers of industrial growth, the drivers of the economies in many African countries, are not the country as a whole, specific subnational entities, cities. Some of you might know, but the GDP for Lagos State, in one of the 32 states in Nigeria, the GDP for Lagos State is greater than GDP of Kenya. So we're thinking about investment and trade. If Lagos goes out and signs a deal, a deal, that's a bigger market than Kenya. So we have to be thinking about all of these issues when it comes to what it actually does mean. On the issue of subsidies, I understand the importance of protecting infant industry, etc., but I'm a little worried in the African context where institutions are really weak and economic governance is quite fragile. Issues relating to costs, quality, wastage, emerge. Yes, we need to think creatively about how, let's assume we're able to address the tariff issues and non-tariff issues. You then kickstart this manufacturing boom and intra-African trade. But I'll be a little cautious about subsidies and protectionism as the pathway to get there.
Joel, do you have anything?
Yeah, I have one comment on subnational. I think part of the uncertainty that we see kind of around global trade, particularly out of the United States and the UK, I think cities as a unit to aggregate citizen kind of thinking and to push that up to the national level, the city is the perfect vehicle to do it. And so I think there are some mayors in the U.S. that should be pushing back on these sorts of trade policies, or to get some more clarity around what exactly America First means. And the same thing from the other side on the African context. I think increasingly, as I see national governments unable to meet the needs or the requirements of its citizens, I'm looking to cities and saying, they're already stepping up, they're already delivering services. Are we moving into a new paradigm where cities are playing a more important and critical role in areas that have often been national level discussions?
Okay. Let me take another round of questions. I will start with my sister right there, and then I'll come to my sister over here. And my other sister over here. All right, so women's turn.
Thank you very much. Pauline Muchina from American Friends Service Committee. I think that America has always had America First agenda. This is not something new. Trump has just made it more obvious and not politically correct. So let's not be deceived to think that this is something new. It's been going on. And the other thing is, African countries have always played in an equal field. They've never had not only the collective power, but because of receiving aid from the Western world, they always are at a disadvantage when they are negotiating trade or any policy. So even coming into this free trade zone, it's not going to be helpful to them or to us because we don't have equal negotiating power within the continent itself and outside the continent itself. And I'm very worried about the role of China in Africa right now, and especially given that the local industries have already been destroyed by China pouring their products into Africa. Now this open trade zone will just make African industries, local industries, more vulnerable, not only to China, but to others. How do we combat that? Thank you.
Okay, was that loaded or what? All right. The question over here.
Hello, my name is Titi Ogundele. I'm a staff assistant at the Department of State's Bureau of Consular Affairs and Overseas Citizen Services. And I guess I have more of a theory and wanted to see if you guys agree with that theory. So Joel, you had mentioned that this time maybe Africa should kind of keep its head down while America figures out what America First really is, and while Brexit figures out what they're doing. I guess my theory is that as Raymond had mentioned about how a lot of the issues in Africa is governance and corruption and things like that, something I'm well aware of as being a Nigerian daughter of Nigerian immigrants, this kind of table dinner conversation talk. I guess my question is, though, do you believe that during this time, like perhaps if Africa is able to figure out a way to create better collective bargaining, that they actually might come out of this not on top, but maybe in a better position? I mean, as my friend over here mentioned, obviously America's always had America first. I mean, most countries have their own interests first anyway, but it looks like, obviously Africa has dealt with the Western world for so long, and we have the recent, insurgence of China in there. Do you feel that this is a time maybe that Africa should possibly just kind of maybe lay low, figure out their own internal items, and then come to the negotiating table a little bit more armed? Thank you.
Okay, then there's a third question over here.
Hello, my name is Raphael Sof. I'm here on behalf of the DC New York Executive Office of Governor Cuomo and the Harvard Institute of Politics. My question is probably directed more to Dr. Hopewell and Dr. Gilpin. Recently, the British government is talking more about the importance of the Commonwealth of Nations and how we can use that group of countries to further our own trade agenda post-Brexit. My question to Dr. Hopewell is, do you see this as a possibility? It's projected that there's going to be a 17% increase in trade operations within the Commonwealth of Nations by 2020. And my question to Dr. Gilpin is, this new African free trade deal, do you see this as a movement away from the Commonwealth, a lack of belief in the system, or as just a separate movement entirely? Thank you.
Okay, another set of really good questions and comments. Let me get to the questions. The role of China in Africa and whether the CFTA will increase the vulnerabilities that China has already exposed when it comes to African economies, actually created and exposed when it comes to African economies. So what are the chances of that happening? Second, collective bargaining. I think we have to separate two things here. The question that I'm hearing really has to be, where does Pan-Africanism meet nationalism in Africa? So the CFTA is based on this ideal of Pan-Africanism. And yet time and time again, we do see, even in African context, national interest sometimes undermining those Pan-African ideals. So what do you see within the CFTA as where Pan-Africanism meets nationalism? What are the touch points? The role of the Commonwealth. One, is this a counter to the CFTA, or is this something that was going to happen? And what is the potential for the new Commonwealth to enhance trade? Joel, I don't know if you want to comment on, I think that was more of a comment, on the extent to which America First has informed U.S. domestic and international policy over the years across administrations. And what it is that's different that we're seeing now, that it's sort of, I think in everybody's mind, there's been an elevation of the America First component of it. I don't know if you have any comments about that. I think I covered all the questions I got. So this time I'll start with you, Joel, swing it out to Raymond, and then come in to Kristen.
No, I think she's absolutely correct that America First has always been a key kind of driving force in our foreign policy. I do think that this administration has put it up front in a way that hasn't been there before. And I think if you look at China's kind of growing economic footprint in Africa, you could say that China First has been very clear for quite a long period of time, where I think the American kind of economic agenda has been a mix of kind of development assistance and economic engagement at the same time. I think there is a better nuance there that you've seen, and I think that will continue. The role of China, I think, there's been various iterations of kind of the Chinese and others, coming into Africa, and that we can go back in history and have lots of conversations about this. I think the Chinese influence will continue to grow. I think the European influence, has been there for a long time. I think it will continue to grow. I think the American influence and the economic over time will continue to grow. And I think what I've seen and what I've been, witnessed during my time, overseas working for the State Department, is the African business community is starting to grow on its own also and to become a counterweight to these conversations. So I think what you're seeing is a maturation of these markets that's heading in the direction that one would expect. And as there is more African capital investing in African opportunities, you're going to see a push out of Chinese and Americans, because the real thing that they bring is capital to invest into these markets and to grow these sorts of business opportunities. And so I'm excited about this kind of African growth of companies, of individuals like Dangote that are going to be, I think, the future of Africa rather than folks coming in from the outside. So I think it's changing. It may not be changing fast enough. Like I said, be patient and persistence, and some of these things I think will change over time. On your question, let me give one tidbit. So I had an advisor to a president who told me something that was, an African president told me something that was very surprising. This African president was actually glad that President Trump won, because he felt it was now Africa's time to do its own thing. And I think you're absolutely correct, that a step back or a change in the American administration's kind of focus, or a different conversation with China, could very likely be a time for African countries to say, okay, what do we need to do together? And I think that's what you can see happening, and I hope that continues to happen. And so when I said kind of keep your head down and be wary, it wasn't keep your head down completely. It was just be careful about these big, shiny objects that are happening, these kind of possible trade wars that are coming. Get your house in order. Make sure you're resilient enough to face kind of whatever's coming in the future.
Thank you. Regarding the question of where Pan-Africanism meets nationalism, ever since the immediate pre-independence years on the continent, there has always been this discussion about how Africa could aggregate its economic might, because the whole thing about political and economic independence has always been there. In the 50s, the 60s, and through to the Abuja Declaration of 1991, which was the precursor to the free trade agreement. That having been said, something that we may be aware of, it's notable that significant economies, South Africa and Nigeria, did not sign. Nigeria ostensibly to consult, yes, but they're more concerned with Chinese dumping, yeah, and dumping of other from other African countries as well. South Africa, I think, are more concerned with the freedom of movement clauses, and what does that mean in terms of migration and trade, etc. And so there really is not a pan-African consensus. National interests are also prominent in Africa. The important thing, I believe, is for the longest time, significant tariff barriers have held African trade and growth back. And I think one of the great things about this whole conversation being had is a recognition that something has to be done. Yeah. But it is not easy, because the economic base for most of the African countries is quite narrow. Tariffs are all they get in terms of revenue. When you reduce tariffs and fiscal revenues plummet, are you going to fire half of the civil service? You can't. And so these are not easy conversations. So the whole tariff issue is not just a trade issue, mm-hmm, it's also a national security issue, it's also an existential issue, which is why it's going to play out. I don't think Africa is moving away from the Commonwealth. Yeah. But in terms of trade, if you look at direction of trade statistics from the 70s through to today, there has been a move away from the traditional trading partners to some of the non-traditional trading partners. Okay. The Commonwealth is going to be important in many other ways, but in terms of trade, I think a number of African countries are going to chart their own course going forward. The last thing about China, one of the former finance minister for Nigeria, Ngozi Iweala, usually when she talks about this, because if you know or you've met her, she's always in African fabric.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and she'll always say, when she was growing up, the fabric was made in the north of Nigeria, and all the patents actually belong to specific groups, ethnic groups. The Chinese came in, took photographs, flooded the market. The textile industry in northern Nigeria has tanked. And it's not because the Chinese came in through the back door and did this. There has to be trade and industrial policy that seeks the interest of African citizens and African businesses first. That's why people pay taxes. It's part of the social contract. And until and unless you can find a way to incorporate that into the way we view trading relations, it doesn't mean that we start shutting the door with China and others. They are important trading partners. The value and volume of China-Africa trade is increasing, as it should. But it has to be done in a way that is circumspect. And my hope is that this conversation around the free trade agreement would force us to rethink a lot of these relationships.
All right. I'll start with the question about the Commonwealth. This has been a big focus in the UK. As I mentioned earlier, a big goal with Brexit is for the UK to regain control over its own trade policy, to be able to negotiate trade agreements independent of the EU. And so the Commonwealth has been one of their key focal points, their sort of dreams of these fantastic trade agreements that are going to flourish amongst the Commonwealth countries, and this flourishing of trade, which I think are vastly overstated and really just a fantasy. If you look at the Commonwealth countries, these are primarily fairly small economies that we're talking about. Some of the largest, like Canada, the EU already has a fairly deep trade agreement with. It's now negotiating agreements with Australia and New Zealand. The biggest economy and the fastest growing is India, of course. But India, if it were to negotiate an FTA with the UK, would have pretty significant demands that there's no way the UK would be interested in meeting, primarily on labor mobility. That's one of India's chief goals in trade negotiations right now, is temporary migration of its high-skilled services workers. And for the UK, that's really the primary rationale behind Brexit. Brexit is not something that's driven by economic nationalism in the same way as Trump's America First trade policies. It's really, it's a political movement. It's a movement primarily driven by anti-immigrant sentiment, coupled with a desire for the UK to regain control, take back control from Europe, is the way it's talked about. So it's the anti-immigrant drive behind Brexit is one of the key factors. So that's fundamentally incompatible with a trade agreement with India seeking greater access to visas for its high-skilled workers. So the prospects of the Commonwealth being a font of new economic activity and trade for the UK, I think, are really a fiction. Especially any gains from potential trade agreements with Commonwealth countries, there's no way that it would ever come close to offsetting the benefits of access to the EU market. The EU is the world's second largest consumer market. There's nothing that the UK could do with the Commonwealth that will ever compensate for the loss of access to the EU market. Wanted to respond to the comment about the US has always been proceeding with America First, which I think is bang on and completely accurate. I think it's important, there's I think sometimes a tendency as we're criticizing Trump and his trade policies to romanticize the pre-Trump era and the way that multilateral trading system operated before Trump. And as was mentioned earlier, the trading system never worked all that well for a lot of developing countries, including African countries. In addition to that, there is more continuity between Trump and his predecessors than I think a lot of us would often like to acknowledge. The U.S. turn away from multilateralism at the WTO and towards an emphasis on bilateral agreements. That preceded Trump. That really started with the Bush administration in the early 2000s when he made a conscious policy change towards competitive liberalization. And that was very much in response to developing countries coming together at the WTO and trying to exercise their collective leverage by taking a shared common negotiating position. And that occurred at the Cancun Ministerial in 2003. Developing countries came together They thwarted a joint US-EU proposal in the agriculture negotiations, resulting in a breakdown of the negotiations. And from that point forward, really transformed the dynamics in the Doha round, where developing countries were coming together and acting as a collective negotiating force. And that was what basically tipped the scales at the WTO and caused the US to shift away from its previous focus on being a leader at the WTO to really looking to engineer these bilateral trade agreements as a way to basically play countries off one another. So the US would use its greater leverage that it had in bilateral negotiations rather than at the multilateral level, where the scales of power were shifting because of developing countries using their collective leverage, but also because of the rise of new powers like China, India, Brazil, South Africa, who are acting as leaders of the developing world at the WTO. So that's on the negotiation side, but even, as I mentioned, Trump is blocking appointments to the appellate body at the WTO and therefore really throwing the dispute settlement mechanism at the WTO into jeopardy. But that didn't start with Trump either. It was actually Obama who first began blocking appointments at the appellate body. So the crisis that we're seeing at the WTO and the trading system, both on the negotiation side and on the dispute settlement side, they have precedence before Trump in US behavior. That being said, I think Trump does still represent a fundamental rupture in the US's approach to multilateralism, to the trading system. While there's some continuity, there's a massive rupture in what he's doing and the danger that his policies potentially represent.
Well, and one thing, let me make one quick point. One thing you're not seeing, and you can comment about it in the UK, but I know this is an issue. When you move out of multilateral into these kind of bilateral agreements, you need a bigger group of individuals helping you negotiating these sorts of things. And neither the United States nor the UK are prepared for the sorts of conversations that they need to be having to start doing massive bilateral, because these things take a long time. And I will tell you, they're really boring to negotiate these sorts of things. So I'm not seeing either of these two governments say, listen, we're staffing our USTR or State Departments or Foreign Office out with 1,000, 2,000 new trade diplomats to do this sort of stuff. So the rhetoric sounds great. I'm not seeing the follow through there.
The infrastructure to back it up.
No,
Okay.
not at all.
I really hate to bring this to a close. Unfortunately, I have to. And just a fantastic panel today. I cannot do justice to all of the issues that have been raised by our speakers and by you, the audience. So maybe I shouldn't even try. But I think what we can all agree on here is that both America First and Brexit are signaling more of an intense focus on unilateralism as opposed to multilateralism. We can have an argument about when that started, but I think there's a case to be made that things have come to a head as far as that transition under the current administration here on America First and for Brexit. So that's one point. The second point that I heard, and I think it was Dr. Hopewell who mentioned this. She reminded us not to be so focused on just what America First is and what Brexit means, and let those two issues, particularly the America First rhetoric, suck up the oxygen in terms of us looking at what else is going on around the world. And she pinpointed China, for example, and addressed some of the number of concerns in terms of China's policies in the trade space, China's interaction with Africa, and some of the issues that need to be looked at in that area, particularly when it comes to subsidies. So I thought that was a very powerful and important reminder. But she also reminded us that the way things are escalating, both at the rhetorical level and in some of the actions that are being taken, that there's a very real potential that we may see a trade war. And that would not be good for so many actors around the world. She talked specifically about the potential of a US-China trade war that could have serious implications for Africa. Let's see. Can't read my own handwriting. That's never a good thing. She also talked to us about the chaotic nature in which Brexit unfolded, and that there's still so much to be defined and plans to be made around the way forward. that it's really difficult right now to assess what sort of an impact Brexit will have on Africa, though she did raise a couple of points. That one, the potential impact could include reduced FDI, could also include reduced demand for African products, and that could hurt the African continent and the US and the UK. But I think a point that all of them made, Raymond talked about the capacity building in terms of negotiating skills and teams on the African end. But I think the same also applies, as we've just heard, for the US and for the UK, when you look at shifting from the multilateral to the bilateral approach and what it's going to take to actually negotiate individual agreements at that bilateral level. Some good recommendations came out of this. For the African countries, diversifying products and reducing dependency, strengthening regional integration, tearing down both tariffs and non-tariff barriers, and having a good industrialization policy. And yes. Joel talked about America First. He emphasized the fact that America First is all about an intense focus on the domestic end of things and less on the international side. But he did point out to all of us that there is no clear or unified understanding of what America First means, and that even at the official level, we lack that narrative, that one narrative that describes this to both Americans, but also for the international world in terms of what America First is. From an Africa perspective, Joel pointed out the lack of, that Africa is not a priority, so it complicates, and it really never has been a priority for the United States. It has increased over the years in terms of focus on Africa, but it's still not a priority, so it makes it even more difficult to figure out what America First means for Africa. But he also mentioned the fact that we have no senior Africa leadership and key US government officials, which makes it really difficult for us to engage on how we might translate America First into US-Africa policy. AGOA, I have nothing to say about that, but I thought your point was really interesting about the out-of-cycle reviews and how we might be turning AGOA from a carrot into a stick. I want to be watching that, obviously. Africans need to figure out, I think, what they want to do beyond AGOA. I think that was one of the key messages that I heard here. This cannot just be an assumption that when AGOA ends in another, 9 years, 8 years, that we're going to have AGOA 3. That Africans really need to figure out how the way forward in AGOA, particularly in the evolving economic environment globally. Africans might disagree with this, but there are many in the United States who do see precisely what Joel talked about, that AGOA as being too generous to Africa, particularly when you juxtapose that against the agreements that Africans are signing, for example, with the Europeans, the EPAs. So what is the United States getting out of that? That's an issue that Africans are going to have to grapple with. Joel recommended for Africa to keep its head down, get its house in order, and not focus so much on what's going on the outside world. He also did talk about some of the positives that are occurring, particularly of the creation of an OPIC on steroids, as you called it, and the MCC, the Millennium Challenge Corporation Modernization Act, that those offer potential benefits in terms of the US-Africa relation, but that what's lacking is the US executive prioritizing Africa. We need to see a little bit more definition and prioritization on that front. Dr. Gilpin reminded us all that the World Trade Organization has not worked well for Africa over the years, and that perhaps we need to focus less on America First and Brexit. They are important developments that have implications for the global trade architecture, particularly the fact that they're now putting on a more transactional approach to doing business, but that Africa needs to look inwards and take care of some business that will leave it in a better position. He talked a lot about the CFTA, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, some of the positives that could emanate from that, but also the challenges on the way ahead to implementation, particularly with regard to addressing the tariffs and the non-tariff barriers, in particular governance issues, corruption issues, connectivity issues, and conflict issues. He talked about developing plans to mitigate the short-term pain that is likely coming. It will come as Africa seeks to implement the Continental Free Trade Agreement. Raised a lot of questions about the capacity for negotiation. And this, for me, is both a technical issue in terms of the technical abilities to conduct negotiations that benefit Africa, but it's also a political issue in terms of African commitment to Pan-Africanism in general. And those two issues, I think, need to be addressed. He emphasized the importance of engaging the regional economic communities and really clarifying the relationships between the CFTA and the regional economic communities if we are to advance and actually realize the CFTA. And then he talked about putting in place the infrastructure for coordination and enforcement to ensure that this Continental Free Trade Area is actually implemented at the national, regional, and continental levels. So fantastic panel. I cannot thank you all enough. I'd like to ask all of you to please join me in thanking our speakers for a really, really good discussion. This is going to be the last in the series for Brown Capital Africa Forum this year. Here in the United States, we are actually taking this discussion to Africa. We will be in Botswana in November 2018 for the signature event, which will be looking at sovereign wealth funds in Africa and their management and their contributions to African development and securing the next generation of securing Africa's future. So it's really a big development for us that we're having this discussion, not just in Washington, but also engaging on the African continent. But we invite all of you. You're the ones who make this program a success. We invite all of you to join us in 2019 when we have another 3 events under the Brown Capital series here at the Wilson Center, and we will release the schedule for that. So please watch out for that schedule on our website, and we do invite you to join us for those discussions. With that, I thank all of you for coming. I thank the Brown Capital Management team for allowing us, supporting us, and giving us the wherewithal to have discussions such as this. So thank you very much to Brown Capital Management. And I thank the Africa Program staff and my colleagues here at the Wilson Center for all their support in making this happen. I'd now like to invite you all to join us for a reception out in the lobby area out there where we can continue the discussion. And I'd like to invite the Brown Capital Management team and our speakers to stay on the stage for a photo, and then we'll join everybody else for the reception. So thank you so much again for coming, and thank you to all of you who are listening in.